red, white and blue, what does it mean to you? Surely you're proud, shout it aloud, Britain's awake. The Empire too, we can depend on you. Freedom remains, these are the chains nothing can break.
I'm pleased to introduce Richard G. Osborne, who's a former resident of Maplewood, who now resides in Boston. Richard is a retired businessman, a world traveler, and has devoted a good portion of his adult life to a study of Winston Churchill. He maintains a private library of over 3,000 books. The thing that impressed me about Richard when I first met him, and when I heard him talk, was that he does not use any notes. He doesn't have a teleprompter. If that rule was imposed on our politicians today, most of them would be struck dumb and would not be able to address the audience. Richard doesn't use any of those devices. After graduation from Columbia High School, he was 1 year ahead of me at Columbia High School, served a tour of duty, United States Army. He earned a BA from Rutgers University, followed by a law degree from Rutgers, and was a classmate of Judge Alvin Weiss, who was here this evening. And they were planning to...
I taught him everything he knows.
But did you teach you everything you know?
I was not in his class, really.
Anyway, Richard got fascinated with the study of history, has read widely, became fascinated with the career of Winston Churchill, and has become a private expert and knows a good deal more than most historians. He's one of the founding members of the Churchill Center and a member of the Churchillian Northeastern Chapter. And frankly, by any definition, Mr. Osborne is truly a historian, and we're honored to have him tonight. Richard, come on up and give us a lecture.
My mobility is not the best because I ruptured my Achilles tendon, and that's why I've got this cane. What I want to do tonight, or intend to do, to try to do, is, incidentally, I'm not using the microphone. If you can't, I think I can project my voice, but if I don't, please give me a signal and I'll move over there. But I've always prided myself that I could bounce my voice off the back walls. I want to paint a verbal portrait of Winston Churchill's life. I bought that portrait of him because it's different than what you usually see of Winston, where it's usually the bulldog look. That shows the jolly Churchill, and he was a jolly person a good part of the time. Loved to party, loved to sing. But before getting to Churchill, I would like to say a few words about the Churchill Center. It is an international organization in all 5 of the English-speaking countries, plus Portugal, plus Israel. That's understandable because Churchill always considered himself a Zionist, and Iceland, strangely enough. It has an international conference once a year, cities like London, recently in Washington, San Francisco, Toronto. We even had one in Boston a couple of years ago. It publishes a quarterly magazine called The Finest Hour. I have a selection of copies up here if you'd like to look at them, and a monthly letter called the Chartwell Bulletin. This Finest Hour is really well worth the price of admission. What does the Churchill Center really dedicate itself to do? It's trying to preserve and enhance the principles of Winston Churchill, which I think I can best summarize by saying, aim high, work hard, and never, never give up. In the United States, we have chapters throughout the states. There is one here in New Jersey, by the way. I belong to the New England one, and we meet once a year on his birthday to celebrate it. It's a fine organization and well worth paying heed to. Now, Churchill himself, I think Shakespeare said there were 7 stages of man. It's very, very difficult to fit this life of Churchill's into 7 stages, maybe 15, 16, or 20. After all, he lived his lifespan covering being a Victorian cavalryman to the atomic age. And he had a varied career. He was born on November 30th, 1874, and even his birth had controversy at the time. He so happened he was born only 7 months after his parents were married, and in Victoria, England, that caused quite a bit of comment at that time. Churchill's only comment on that later was, while present at the event, he could not testify to the events preceding it. Churchill's early life cannot be termed a happy one. He really had a most unhappy childhood. His parents really paid little or scant attention to him. Lord Randolph Churchill, his father, never really liked Winston and had a very low opinion of him. Jenny, well, she was busy with balls, and once Lord Randolph's infirmity hit him, with affairs, with everyone from King Edward on down. She didn't miss one of them. And Winston was packed off to school at a very early age, boarding school. In one case, he had a very sadistic headmaster who beat him quite severely, enough to scar him. And parents didn't even know this. The only way they found out about it was the nanny, Mrs. Everett, discovered it and brought it to their attention, and then Jenny did move him to another school. At school, he confirmed Lord Randolph's low opinion of him. He wasn't a good student, and never would be a good student while he was in school. He was an athlete, however. I know we all think of that 5'7" rotund guy that we knew in later life, but as a young student, he was the fencing champion of the English public schools. His letters home to his parents are almost heartbreaking, the way he pleaded for attention and asked to be able to spend his vacations with them, asked them to visit him. I think in all the time he was away at school, his father only visited him twice, and that briefly for some formality. Jenny did write to him regularly, but he was pretty much left on his own. Well, as he went on in school, it was quite evident that he was not going to go to Cambridge or Oxford. He just wasn't that kind of a student. He was good at riding and fencing, and so it was determined that the best course of action for him was a military life. So he applied to Sandhurst, and on the third try, he did get into Sandhurst, the British Military Academy, and he got in. Now, Sandhurst is a little different from our West Point. At West Point, the cadets get a very well-rounded, outstanding education. At the time Churchill went to Sandhurst, it was strictly a military education. But he got through and did graduate, and he was assigned to the 4th Hussars, a cavalry regiment, which further distressed Lord Randolph because that meant they had to buy some horses. The 4th Hussars were about to be assigned to, so I can lean a little more, assigned to India. But before he would go there, Churchill, upon graduation, was granted a 6-month leave. He was never one to be inactive, so he took himself across the Atlantic Ocean to go see, be an observer of the Cuban insurrection that was going on against the Spanish government. He went across the ocean that time in a ship that was powered by sails and steam. The last time he would cross the Atlantic, he would do it in a jet plane. So he got to Cuba. It's the first time that Churchill went in harm's way, where he could hear the whine of bullets. And he was actually, for his time there, was decorated by the Spanish government, although his sympathies were pretty much with the Cubans. When he went back, he went to India on his assignment, and he discovered that life in India wasn't so bad for a British officer. They had servants. He discovered the joys of, he'd been exposed to champagne, brandy, and wines before this, but he had never really been interested in whiskey, but he did discover Scotch whiskey while he was in India. It was one of his great accomplishments there. And for those of you who are interested, his favorite Scotch throughout his life was Johnny Walker Red Label. My exclusive Scotch myself. But he also realized when he got to India, it was really a watershed time for him, that he had a very poor education. And he undertook a self-education program, became a voracious reader of the classics, everything he could find. And he had a prodigious memory. Everything he read, he remembered. And by the time he left India, he really turned himself into a highly educated person. He also proved his athletic prowess while he was in India. He became an outstanding polo player, and actually 2 times rode for the team that won the Indian Polo Championship. And as you all know, polo originated in India, so that was no small accomplishment. Actually, the last time he rode, he had fallen on a dock and hurt his left arm quite badly, or shoulder. He had to have his left arm strapped to his side while he rode. Now, since he had the mallet in the other hand, I don't know what he was doing with the reins, but he did it. And incidentally, that shoulder injury would plague him his entire life. He also, in India, developed his first love, a beautiful girl named Pamela Plowden, and for years they were sort of unofficially engaged. But as time went on, Churchill realized that Pamela really had to marry somebody who had a lot of money, and they eventually drifted apart. But he had proposed to her, and that was his first proposal. He was to propose to 2 other women before he married Clementine. Later, a Welsh heiress by the name of Muriel Wright, maybe a little side go ahead of the story here, who was quite wealthy and also very, very pretty, but she wasn't about to marry anybody. She had money, youth, and looks, and she was having too much fun. Actually, she did not marry until she was in her 40s. The third lady that he proposed to marry was the American actress Ethel Barrymore. So that's sort of surprising. He also, while he was in India, again went in harm's way, where he went to the northwest frontier and fought there Afghanistan, and quite heroically. In one battle, he was under fire for 13 straight hours. And at a point in that battle, he went out beyond the lines to rescue an Indian soldier and carry him back to safety on his back. This would be the subject of his first book, The American Field Force, which he wrote in 1898. And I do want to make one quotation. I'm going to read one thing because I want to get it straight. It's paraphrased a bit. It's about Muslims. He wrote this in 1898. No stronger retrograde force exists in the world. A militant faith paralyzes the social development of those who follow it, a threat to Western civilization. Sounds interesting. So that was his first book. He would follow it up with a second book not long after called Savonarola. A work of fiction, the only one he ever wrote. I read that book, and I think I understand why he never wrote fiction again. That's enough. I don't mean to be a literary critic. Excuse me, my cane's getting... Well, Churchill began to realize that he did not want a military career. He wanted to get into politics. So he thought he'd better go where the action is. And he appealed to Mother Jenny, who had great influence with a lot of high-powered people by this time. His father had died in 1895, on January 24th. So, and she started to take a much greater interest in her son, Winston. And he wanted to go to Egypt, where Kitchener was about to go down the Nile to avenge Chinese Gordon, who had died, I think, was some 10 years before, at Khartoum. And Churchill went and did get assigned Kitchener didn't like this at all. He didn't like the son of a lord being on his, in his army, and really didn't like the fact that Winston was there, because he not only went as a soldier, he went as a war correspondent. He was writing an article for a British newspaper on the war. Churchill got there, he served, he took part in the last great cavalry charge at Omdurman in any war, where he killed and could have been killed. Actually, this may not be well known, but Churchill took part in 16 battles in his life where he could have been killed and did kill. He was taken aback to a large measure by the savagery. The British had the Gatling gun and they don't, and the slaughter of the dervishes appalled him, and particularly was appalled by the desecration of the Mahdi's tomb in Khartoum and the digging up of his bones, some of which were tossed in the Nile. And he wrote his third book on this, called The River War, which Queen Victoria read and was horrified. He was quite complimentary about Kitchener's tactics, but he also was critical of the way he treated the enemy. And they had to take what bones were left of the Mahdi and give him a proper burial. In any case, he went back to England at this point, and of course, shortly after, the Boer War came around. This time, he went on assignment, although still a military officer, as a war correspondent completely. He was not officially assigned to the army. While there, one of the officers who knew him from past experience said, "We're going on a reconnaissance. Would you like to go with us?" He said, "Certainly." It was a reconnaissance in an armored train. Now, why you would do a reconnaissance on an armored train, that's hardly a way to do it and not be noticed. And the Boers did notice it, and they ambushed that armored train and pretty much devastated it. Although Churchill did not take part in the fighting, but he was instrumental in getting the wounded on the train and it going back to the lines. They were going up towards the town of Ladysmith. He rode with that train back around a mile and then returned to the fighting of the soldiers who were left. At that point, he was captured. He likes to tell everyone that he was captured by the leader of the Boers, Botha, but that story is termed apocryphal. He had a habit of sometimes enhancing things, like in polo, he would write to Jenny and tell her that he scored 3 goals when it counts he'd only scored 1, but he was not, throughout he was given to maybe enhancing himself a bit. He was captured and he told them, he said, "I never fired this gun in the battle, I'm a war correspondent, you should let me go." And the Boers thought about that for a while, but they thought a son of a lord was too big a price, and they put him in prison. And of course, he was only there a short time, and he escaped and traversed over 200 miles of enemy-held territory to freedom, getting to Durban, and discovered all the time the British newspapers were writing about this man who had escaped and was somewhere out in the boondocks. And he discovered he was a hero. He had escaped and gotten back to lines. Now, he stayed in Africa long enough to serve in the relief of Ladysmith, but then he went back to England as a famous person, and he was elected in 1900 to Parliament, where he would serve for 64 years. And he went into the Conservative government. Now, he got in there and discovered that his thought wasn't really in line with what the Conservatives want. He was a free trader all his life, believed in free trade. He also met a fellow by the name of Lord George, and George became very close. They were referred to as the Heavenly Twins, and he decided really he ought to be in the Liberal Party. So he did what the British term ratted. He crossed over and joined the other party. Well, the Conservatives were a long time forgiving this action. He got in his first thing, he became Undersecretary for the colonies under Lord Elgin, and he really enjoyed that job because Elgin liked to spend most of his time on his estates up in Scotland, and so really Churchill was running the office. And then, lo and behold, at age 36, he was made First Lord of the Admiralty. He really went at this job with a vengeance. First off, in addition to the First Lord of the Admiralty, there are four Sea Lords. Well, they changed 3 of them, and 2 of those men never forgave Churchill for being bumped out of office. He modified the Navy. He changed it from coal to oil. He increased the caliber of their guns and also introduced air flight to the Navy. He also loved the perks of being First Lord of the Admiralty because you got a yacht. And as the conservative critics said, every time he goes out to inspect something, does he have to go on the yacht? Can't he take the train occasionally? And but he loved it. And he really got the Navy ready for the First World War. Kitchener said this when Churchill was later removed from office. He said, no matter what they say, Winston, you had the Navy ready. Well, of course, that led to his greatest problem, the Dardanelles. Now, there was a great quest for another front, another place to fight, because just recently, the British Army at Ypres had lost casualties, 26,000 men in one day on the Western Front. Also, the Russians, as they did in the Second World War, were pushing for the British and the French to do something different because they had a lot of pressure on them from the Germans and the Turks, and they said, listen, we don't know if we can hold out unless you do something to distract them. So the British generally were looking for another place to fight. And there were several considerations. It was Churchill who came up with the idea, we'll go to the Dardanelles. We'll sail up the Dardanelles through straits and knock the Turks out of the war. Well, this proved to be not too successful, as you doubtless know. The first part of that campaign was fought with the Navy without the Army. The second part was fought with the Army without the Navy. The first part was jeopardized by timid admirals, and the second part by incompetent generals. Also, the War Cabinet was very, very slow to act to any requests on Churchill's part for additional troops or ships or what have you. Anyway, it was not successful. Actually, most of the casualties at Gallipoli happened after Churchill was removed from office. And later, in a board of inquiry, he was absolved of blame, but he had that stigma on his record for the rest of his career. The conservatives Britain realized at this point they had to have a consolidated government. And the conservatives said they would come in with the liberals, but only if Winston was out. So Winston was removed from office. And it was a very difficult time for him. Winston, all his life, suffered from depressions, what he termed his black dog, and the most severe black dog he ever had was after he was out of office. And he was really, Clementine was fearful of his life, that it would kill him. Well, as luck would have it, one day while he was doing absolutely nothing, he was out to somebody's home, and he wandered in the garden, and a lady was in the garden painting. And he said, that looks very interesting. Now, Churchill never, at that age, he was 40 years old now, had never been to an art gallery, never had an art lesson or anything like that. He decided to take up painting. So on day 1, he bought a children's paint box. On day 2, he bought all the professional paraphernalia he could find. At first, he was in awe of the white canvas, and he would stare at it for a long time. It frightened him almost, until a lady came along one day. What are you doing? Why aren't you painting? Give me a big brush. And she splashed paint all over it, you know, bold colors. She was a painter herself. And he said, from that moment on, the canvas never bothered me. And he would paint for the rest of his life. And in his life, I have a few reproductions up here, if you want to look at them, of some of his paintings. He painted, I believe by actual count, 453 paintings in his life. He painted from that time on, right up, within a couple of years of his death. The only time he did not paint, he only painted one painting throughout the Second World War. That was a painting that he painted in Marrakesh of the sunset over the Atlas Mountains, and he gave it to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Franklin took it home with him, and I don't know whether he didn't appreciate it or what, or wasn't a painting. Anyway, he gave it to one of his sons. The son kept it a short time and gave it to another relative, and that painting ended up in somebody's attic for years and years and years, where a few years ago it was discovered and sold for over $1 million. Painting critics say that if Churchill had devoted his life to painting, he could have been the greatest painter of his time. He was a bold painter, an audacious painter. He liked a lot of color. And his paintings, well, I'll go to Harry Truman. Later, when his paintings toured the United States after the war, Truman went to see them, and his one comment was, "Damn good." Violet Asquith, the daughter of the Prime Minister at the start of the First World War, said it was the only time in his life he was ever silent. When he painted, he didn't talk. And his daughter, youngest daughter, Mary Soames, said it was a joyride in a paint box. But this painting really, and it would later in his life too, when these periods of Black Dog hit him, painting really took him out of it. He took himself now to the second front, again went in harm's way, the Western Front, where he was not a chateau officer. He was a battalion commander in the front line trenches. And he was there for 6 months. Now, I will admit that Churchill went with all the comforts he could take. He went amply supplied with brandy and scotch and what have you. He also brought a portable bathtub with him, so he lived well. It is interesting to note, in the sector he was responsible for, in the German sector across the way, there was another fellow who, when he got a few spare moments, would paint. He was only a corporal. His name was Adolf Hitler. He was the closest that Churchill and Hitler ever came. Now, I know during the war there was a lot of propaganda about Hitler, the house painter. He actually was a pretty good painter, if you want to be perfectly honest about it. His paintings, though, Churchill's were bright and bold. His were dark, very dark. Rather good, though. You know, and whatever Hitler became later, he was a very brave soldier. In the First World War, he was decorated twice for bravery and ended up the war in hospital bed, temporarily blinded by gas. But anyway, Churchill served his time there with distinction and then went back to Parliament. By this time, Lloyd George had enough power that he could bring Churchill back into government, and he became Minister of Munitions, later Secretary of War, where the gentleman spoke before that one of the last battles was the British Expeditionary Force, which Churchill authorized in Russia. But Lloyd George's government was in trouble, wasn't doing well. Lloyd George had gotten in a few messes, and Churchill looked around. Churchill was always an opportunist, and he ratted again. He went back to the Conservative Party. As Churchill described it, he said, anyone can rat once, it takes a genius to rat twice. So he was back in the Conservative Party, and he rose up. He eventually became Chancellor of the Exchequer. And also another very important assignment, he also, before that, was Colonial Secretary. And had a hand in the creation of something. Had a hand, he did it. Churchill, with the help of Gertrude Bell, a lady who had lived all her life in the Mideast, and T. Lawrence of Arabia, created Iraq. Now, you can question their judgment on this a little bit because they took three tribes that hated each other, Shiites, the Sunnis, and the Kurds, and merged them together in one country, took a king who'd never been in the area, and made him king of the whole thing. But that's how Iraq got started. It was created. And there's a book about this. It's called Churchill's Folly. Churchill himself was also writing. He wrote a biography of his father. He never ceased to love his father, although his father had shown him little love. I say his biography of Lord Randolph was pretty much a whitewash job. He also wrote a great volume, 6 volumes on the First World War called World Crisis, and would shortly write his great biography of his famous ancestor, Marlborough. But in any case, he was having a falling out with the conservatives again. Look, Churchill was a 19th century man who was dropped into the 20th century, and he had a lot of the prejudices of 19th century people. He didn't want Commonwealth status for India. He didn't like the idea of Gandhi. He referred to Gandhi as a half-naked faker. He didn't believe the colonial people could govern themselves. He had a low opinion of them. You know, in this, his views were exactly similar to Teddy Roosevelt's. Not about India, but about Asia, mostly there. In fact, and you know, Teddy Roosevelt didn't like Churchill at all. He had met him, didn't like him. His daughter said later, was asked, and why didn't your father like Churchill? He said they were too much alike. Well, and you know, the only people that really, Roosevelt, a little aside here, admired in the Far East were the Japanese. And the main reason he admired them was because of their sneak attack on Port Arthur in the Japanese-Russian War, which actually was a very nice dress rehearsal for some place called Pearl Harbor. But he thought that was quite a stroke. Well, so at this point, Churchill, he just was so out of pace with what the conservatives wanted to do. He entered his wilderness years, still a member of Parliament, but without any office. And you know, life wasn't the best for him. He had now had 5 children, although the 4th one, Marigold, died when she was an infant. He had bought Chartwell, which horrified Clementine because of the expense involved. He also suffered in the crash, lost most of his money, and to top it all off, while on a lecture tour in the United States, he was hit by a taxi cab on 5th Avenue and rather badly hurt. He was living by one method alone, his pen. And sometimes that was pretty sketchy, but he never changed his lifestyle. It was always the very best of everything. So he was really sort of out of it. And in 1936, he compounded his difficulty. He supported Edward VIII being retained as king. Churchill was a royalist, there's no question about it, and he thought some means should be found so Edward could stay king. Now, I'm sure many of you in this audience saw the picture of the King's speech. That movie seemed to give the impression that Churchill was supportive of the king that later became George VI. He was not. In fact, George almost never forgave him for his actions there. And it was the only time in the House of Commons when Churchill rose to speak that he was shouted down and couldn't speak in support of Edward. So he was really on the outs. But something was to save him, because this was also the period of what one author termed the Dark Valley, the rise of Nazi Germany. And Churchill rose to be the unregarded prophet of the dangers, originally the unregarded prophet of the dangers of Nazi Germany. And he spoke again, demanding rearmament. And more people began to listen to him. And when Munich happened and Chamberlain said it's peace in our time, Churchill said it's unmitigated disaster. Well, in any case, it proved to be a disaster as Hitler continued on his romp through Europe and the war started. And Churchill was now recalled to be First Lord of the Admiralty again. That career didn't last too long because Chamberlain finally realized, with Norway being lost and the invasion of France, that he was not in a position to govern. Actually, he would die a year later of cancer. And they had to find a new prime minister. Now, nobody in power wanted Churchill. The king didn't want Churchill. He still resented him back from 1936. Sir Stafford Cripps, one of the leaders of the Conservative Party, didn't want him. Rab Butler didn't want him. But there was one important group that wanted him, and that was the people. And Churchill became prime minister. And this is where I think he had his finest hour, because he mobilized the English language into a weapon of war and stood alone. Now, many of the key people in England wanted to sue for peace. They said, if we can get any kind of a good deal, we better take it. Churchill said, no, if I were to surrender, the British people would rise up and tear me for this post. And he promised the British people only one thing: blood, sweat, and tears, as you all know. And he said, we will never surrender. And that's what I think, with his voice almost, he stopped the march of tyranny. Think for a minute, what if England had surrendered? What kind of a world would we have been in then? Hitler would have controlled all of Europe. Do you think Russia could have stood up against him then? He nearly beat them as it was. But I think, Churchill was later, they said to him, you have the heart of a lion, Winston. He said, I didn't have the heart of a lion. The British people had the heart of a lion. I merely supplied the roar. He knew now that the one thing he had to do was get the United States in this war if he was to win. He stopped it, and it would take, look, we all know it took the efforts of a lot more people to win that mammoth war than Winston Churchill. But they never would have had the chance to do that if Churchill hadn't stood firm when he did. And now we begin the period of the epic friendship that was formed, which John Meacham has wrote a beautiful book about, Franklin and Winston. And they'd actually met once. At the end of the First World War, they were both in Paris. Actually, Churchill never remembered meeting Franklin, but Franklin did remember meeting Winston. And frankly, when asked about him, he said, he's a stinker. He didn't show it to him at all. But they started to talk, and together they would forge an alliance that would lead the free world to victory. It was a relationship of great depth. I mean, there were times when they were cross with each other. There were times when they would die for each other. There's one story about the cross era where it was reported to Winston that Roosevelt had said, Winston has 100 ideas a day, some of which are good. To which Winston said, this from a man who never had an original idea. But they went on. In this relationship, you must bear in mind, though, that it was always Churchill who was doing the wooing. He was the one that would go anywhere and meet with and sought after Roosevelt. Roosevelt was a man of secrets. He liked to keep people off balance. Not only Winston, but Eleanor, his cabinet, anybody. Lord knows. And their relationship probably reached a peak at the Casablanca conference, where Churchill said, he's the truest friend, the greatest man I have ever known. After that, there was a certain amount of drift in their relationship. By the time they got to Tehran and later to Yalta, Roosevelt was refusing to meet alone with Churchill. He was more consistently siding with Stalin. In fact, on several occasions, together they even made Churchill the butt of jokes. And now there's a certain justification for Roosevelt's actions in that he and Churchill had very different war aims. They both wanted victory, number one. But number two, Churchill wanted to preserve the British Empire, and Roosevelt wanted to end the British Empire. No uncertain terms. And so they began to drift apart. I think that Churchill was far quicker to realize the threat of post-war Stalin. Well, I think Roosevelt looked at Stalin and said, there's a man I can handle. In fact, he said at one point, and if these words sound familiar, think back to Neville Chamberlain. I think Uncle Joe is a man, when he gives his word, you can depend on it. Now, Chamberlain said the same thing about Hitler, the very same. And I think Stalin looked at Roosevelt and saw a dying man, because he was to die on April, what was it? 12th, 1945. Now, why didn't Churchill go to the funeral? He had a plane all set up to do it. At the last minute, he decided he had other pressing business and didn't go. I've never heard anybody explain fully why he didn't go. I think, I have a reason why he didn't go. I think for so long, he'd been the wooer. He thought, let him come to me. I've been in this thing from the beginning, let him come to me. In that, I think he was wrong. There was no way that the ill-prepared Harry Truman could take time to go to England to see Winston. After all, Roosevelt had done nothing to prepare Truman. Truman didn't even know there was an atomic bomb project. So he didn't go. I wonder if Churchill didn't regret that for the rest of his life, because it would have given him a wonderful platform. But the war ended, and he was out of office. As you know, you don't vote for the prime minister in England, you vote for the party, and the party that wins. We now come to 1946 and his famous Iron Curtain speech. Now, why did Churchill, who was getting invitations from all the big universities, go to Fulton, Missouri, to that little school to give a talk? Simply put, because Harry Truman had written a note with the invitation, said, if you can do this, Winston, I'd really appreciate it. And when the President of the United States said that, he was there. Now, he went to Washington first, rode on the train with Harry, showed him the speech before he gave it. It was not titled Iron Curtain, it was called The Sinews of Peace. But when the speech was given, the American media decided it was hawkish, warmongering. And he was really criticized, and the Truman administration sort of backed away from this thing. But he gave the speech 2 more times and people began to listen. And I think it's one of the reasons that shortly afterward in the Middle East, the Truman Doctrine came into being. But he was returned to office in 1951, and as Prime Minister, he was also to get some honors. He wrote his 6-volume history of the Second World War, received the Nobel Prize for Literature. In 1963, John Kennedy made him honorary citizen of the United States, only the second person to get that honor, the other being Lafayette. And really what Churchill was striving for the whole time, he wanted a summit between the United States, Russia, and England. And he would work on one and then the other, but it never came about because he was mostly at this point worried about the United States. He thought the Eisenhower-Dulles tandem was a little bit on the hawkish side, and he was afraid they might use atomic power in Korea. But it wouldn't happen. At this point, too, by 1953, he was in the dying embers of greatness. He was beginning to slip and slip badly. He'd fall asleep. He would lose thoughts in mid-sentence. His colleagues began to describe him as gaga. And Macmillan and Eden would go to him and they'd say, Winston, it's time for you to step aside. And but he would have had a communication from Russia or the United States, which gave him a glimmer of hope that he could arrange this summit, which is his great desire. And he would say, next fall, or in the beginning of winter. And he did this dance for a year and a half of delaying. But finally, he realized that he had to step aside. He couldn't do it anymore. And he retired, stayed a member of Parliament. He would serve there until 1964. And finally would die on the 24th of January, 1965, exactly 70 years from the date of death of his father. He always said he would die on the same day of his father. His last words were, "I'm bored with it all. It's been an interesting journey, well worth taking once." I want to say a few words in conclusion. I know you'll be relieved as I see that clock is moving around. I think, this is my opinion, I think Winston, well, let's call him by his whole name. Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill was the greatest man of the 20th century. Sure, he could be petulant, he could be childish, he had a temper, but you know, he never held grudges. But he stood alone at a critical time in history, and I think really saved Western civilization. I want to get a few words in here. As I said earlier, you only have to ask what if he had not stood firm in 1940. He indulged in things, but his genius, his persistence, his never give up attitude really carried him through. And I'll close with the words of his daughter, his youngest daughter, Mary Soames, who tragically died just a little over a year ago, his last child. "I owe you what every man, woman, and child owes you, my liberty. Thank you." Questions, I'll try and answer anything.
First of all, I want to thank you for your history lesson. I learned so much. But the most important subject you didn't delve on. Why didn't Hitler invade England?
Well, I know you've had a lot of talk here about the Second World War, and I didn't want to repeat things that you've done. I've often wondered about that too. First off, play what if with Hitler. Guderian's panzers should have been at Dunkirk 24 hours before the British Expeditionary Force. There should have never been a Dunkirk. There are some things that have been written by some historians that suggest that Hitler really didn't want to defeat England. He always regarded the British Empire as a stabilizing force in the world.
Would you be better off sitting here?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
This thing is done.
Okay, thank you everybody, and bear with me.
No, okay, that's not the problem.
As I said, I wish I could tell you this happened to me in a romantic way. Actually, I did. I was rescuing a small tousled-haired child from a runaway horse when I leaped in front of him. But don't praise me for that. I think also Goering said, I can finish them off for the Air Force, you don't have to do it. And I think he was influenced by Goering. What I've always wondered is why he stopped his panzers when they could have cut the British Army off completely. Maybe then it was fear of the Navy and crossing that 20 miles of water. There's no question if he could have gotten his army across, there's no way. They could fight on the beaches and the plains and the cities and the hills, but it wouldn't have lasted very long. But I can't tell you exactly what was in Hitler's mind.
One of the things that's interesting about that aspect of it is that Hitler was supposed to have told his generals that the reason he let the British escape was they didn't want to kill racial kinsmen, because he had fought the British in the First World War and had respected them for their fighting ability, and he believed there was a peace party that would make a deal with him after the British Army was allowed to escape. It was sort of a peace offering.
Yeah, I think he thought, you know, the British Empire was all over the world,
Yeah.
and he thought it was a good stabilizing force. And I think he was confident too that they would, and many people, as I said, wanted to do just that. You know, I didn't deal with the French fleet issue either, but because I knew you'd had a talk about a year ago on that subject in depth. But there are two aspects. Number one, I think Churchill had to order that. He couldn't run the risk of the French fleet falling in their hands. But no, there was another big reason for it. It helped convince Roosevelt that England was in the war to stay. Because remember, Kennedy, who was the ambassador, was sending back notice after notice to Roosevelt that he didn't like Churchill. England's losing the war, they're going to lose it. And this was a great proof that they intended to carry on the fight. You know, Kennedy, when he was finally recalled, asked for an audience with Roosevelt up at Hyde Park, and he went up there, and this is the report of it, I wasn't there, I can't testify, that for 2 hours he talked with Roosevelt about the treatment of himself, and sort of whined about it, and finally Roosevelt had enough of Kennedy, and excused himself. He found Eleanor and said, give him lunch, and then get him out of here, and I never want to see that son of a bitch again.
By the way, it's interesting, there was Huntington Park Press had an article, there's a new book that just came out on the Kennedys and the Churchills called When Lions Roar. It's just released by Thomas Mayer, and it's 784 pages. It's pretty significant. Yeah,
you were showing me that. Of
Right.
course, the Churchill that he's talking about is Randolph, his son, though, not Winston.
Well, no, this is about Winston. This is about the whole family.
But I mean the affairs. Cause,
Yeah, I know, but the whole family was...
in his home, once he married Clementine, every available record is that Churchill never had an extramarital affair with anybody.
I have a few comments just on what you
Although
said.
she did.
Right. Churchill was supposed to have said that Muslim in a man is like rabies in a dog.
Maybe he did, I don't know.
And the second thing is there's a very good movie on the life of Churchill's early career called Young Winston.
Yes, there is.
Which is extremely well done and should be watched by anyone to see what happened at Omdurman during the Boer War. And then one of the other factors is when they converted the British Navy from coal to oil, that was one of the things that led the British to stop supporting the Ottoman Empire because they wanted the oil of Saudi Arabia and Kuwait.
It's one of the reasons for the creation of Iraq, too.
Yes, well, that was the Sykes-Picot Agreement, where they carved, actually, they screwed the Kurds, they divided them between Turkey, Iraq, and Iran. And that's why it's all animosity, because in the Ottoman Empire, there's a great new book on the Ottoman Empire called A Land of Sighing Hearts. And it's a whole history of the Ottoman Empire in World War I, military, political, social, and economic. And
let's let some other people get in there. Neil, we have some other questions back here. Thanks.
Yes, sir.
Would you speak briefly about the relationship of with Harry Hopkins, with the between Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin?
Well, to the best of my knowledge, Churchill really liked Harry Hopkins and found in him a great supporter. You know, Hopkins, there's controversy about him, but Churchill, I think Hopkins played a big part in helping create the friendship between Roosevelt and Churchill subsequently. And let me also say, in regards to the early life of Churchill, if you want to read a great book, and Churchill himself wrote it, it's My Early Life. It really is well written, it really gives a great picture. And as far as the Middle East is concerned, if you want to read an interesting book, Gertrude Bell's, the story of Gertrude Bell, Queen of the Desert, and her life in that amongst the Arabs. Yes, sir.
I really enjoyed. Thank you for coming.
Well, thank you.
Appreciate it. If you had one quote that's attributed to Winston, that's your favorite, what would it be?
Repeat the question.
I'll answer that.
Yeah.
Churchill, in one of his visits to Washington, was staying in the White House, and he liked to take baths, and very often would come out of the bath and dictate to his secretaries while walking around the room in his birthday suit. He did it. And one time, Roosevelt wheeled himself into Churchill's suite or whatever it was, and there was Churchill standing stark naked. And Roosevelt said, "Oh, I'm sorry," and went to withdraw. And Churchill said, "Don't. As you can see, Mr. President, the Prime Minister of England has nothing to hide from you." I also told, I said this to John over dinner, and I try and make this a fresh talk. I'm never quite sure what I'm putting in. And about Churchill's prodigious memory. On another trip there, he and Roosevelt went on a motor trip up into Maryland to relax a bit, and they went through the town of Fredericksburg, and Churchill looked out the window and saw the Barbara Fritchie candy store. And it said, "Barbara Fritchie." Now, and Roosevelt immediately said yes, and quoted the famous one line from that poem, "Whoever harms yon gray hair dies like a dog, the general said, march on," something like that. And when he finished, Winston picked up and quoted from memory all 60 lines of the Whittier poem.
Wow.
He was a great student of American Civil War, as a matter of fact. Yes, sir.
Yeah, my view of Winston Churchill isn't quite the same as yours. I mean, I see a man that threw a lot of people under the bus.
He probably did. He wasn't.
And spent a good part of his life writing to promote himself.
Yes.
And when he made mistakes, like we fought in Italy because he thought that we would liberate Rome in October of 1945. We didn't until 7 months later. And he made mistakes, and people who were part of his strategy that didn't achieve what he wanted, he'd throw under the bus. So there's a big piece of him that he completely lacked humility, to me, and that's why I think a lot of people aren't as big on him.
Well, you're to a large degree correct. He certainly lacked what you said. As for Italy, I'm no war strategist. I will say one thing. Italy proved not to be the soft underbelly. But it did do one thing, which a lot of people forget. That offensive, Hitler had planned his last great offensive in Russia, which was a gigantic pincers movement, which started out and was succeeding to a large extent. This is while they were still in Russia. And when Italy happened, Hitler called a halt to that and diverted some of his key troops from the Russian front to the Italian front. So it did have that effect. It did relieve a lot of pressure on Russia. He had trouble with generals, and sometimes it wasn't fair. His sacking of Wavell in the Mideast, I think, was a crime. Wavell was a great general, but he couldn't communicate. Lincoln had a lot of problems with generals, too. And sometimes Churchill was influenced how they looked, if they looked like a general, they...
Huge mistake he didn't sack Montgomery. Huge mistake.
Pardon?
That he didn't sack Montgomery.
We
Huge
can't
mistake.
hear her.
Well,
Would you repeat what she said, please?
yes, he said that he should have sacked Montgomery. I don't know whether at that point he had the privilege of sacking Montgomery, because Eisenhower was the supreme commander there.
Eisenhower wanted him gone.
General Montgomery was a general that didn't want to move until everything was in place.
Yeah.
I mean, that Alamein, and I can't recall them offhand. There's some pretty funny things that Churchill said about George Montgomery, the movie star, cowboy star, goes where my brain is.
A couple more questions, then we'll have...
There's one back there.
Boris Johnson, the mayor of London, just wrote a history book called The Churchill Factor.
I'm sorry, I can't hear.
Okay. Boris Johnson, the mayor of London, just wrote a book.
Yes,
The Churchill Factor. I wonder if you can comment on it.
I have not read that book. It really is very favorable to, I've read several reviews of it. it certainly is a book. If you want to be pro Winston, that book, I understand, will make you more pro Winston. Now, I've done a lot of reading on Churchill, and boy, I'm not blind to his works. I'd like to say, when I say I think he's the greatest man of the 20th century, it's because of one capsule in his life. I think without him, we'd be living in a far different world today. But you know, he could be mean, he could be hard on people, but you know, he never held a grudge.
Okay, maybe one more question.
I think there's one over here.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
If he was a Zionist, why did he give the attempts to form an Israeli state or a Jewish state such a tough time?
Well, you're referring to the time when he was back as prime minister.
Yes.
You got to repeat the question.
He wanted to know why Churchill, I don't claim to be expert in this. I do know his official biographer, Churchill's official biographer, Martin Gilbert, has written a whole book about Churchill and the Jews and treats Churchill quite kindly in that. And I do know that Churchill always believed in a Zionist state of Israel. The fact that he may have resisted things in that last few years, there could have been other forces. I'm sorry, I'm not up on that. Okay. I won't speak in his defense. Or yes.
I read that book, Roosevelt and the Jews. It's fascinating. The name of the author escapes me.
Martin Gilbert.
Two things come out of it.
Roosevelt and the Jews was Richard Reich. He spoke here.
He was here.
Yes.
Spoke
here. Oh, that's right. We had that.
Yeah.
Two things came out of it that impressed me. One, at that time, the United States was strongly anti-war. However, Roosevelt realized the fate of the United States for the future lied in our getting involved in that mess at the time. And Churchill did a tremendous job of reading that, what was going on in Roosevelt's mind, and being able, over the years until we got into the war, of drawing Roosevelt into a position of actually bringing the United States into the war.
Well, this clearly was Churchill's objective, to get him in whatever he had to do.
The other point that was raised about Churchill's Zionism, I think it was expressed in the book that Churchill just decided that as far as Great Britain was concerned, the war was paramount and they were going to do nothing as far as the Holocaust was concerned, except to pursue the conclusion of the war.
Well, the greatest effect that had was Churchill did nothing throughout the war while he was prime minister to prepare for a peacetime England, while the Labour side was for several years worked on that. So they had a program to offer the people on that election. It's one of the main reasons the Conservatives lost the election. They had no platform, where the Labour Party had developed one. They were fighting the war.
Okay.
One last question.
Okay, last question.
Is it true that Winston's mother was an American?
Pardon? Yes, she was American. Jenny Jerome. She was born in Brooklyn.
Brooklyn?
Yeah. And her father was an incredibly wealthy person. He made a lot of money, lost a lot of money, but he had a home, and it had a ballroom in it and everything.
Her father was in real estate. In New York.
Yes.
Jerome Avenue was named after
Jenny Jerome. She's a beautiful woman. I mean, the pictures you see of her, she's incredibly beautiful. And she had a very romantic life. She had a second marriage. She married a guy who was around 2 months older than Winston.